"Do you trust me, baby?" he asked in that voice that always had a smirk hidden in it, as if every word was slightly wrapped in a rustle of sarcasm. But this time something in his tone had subtly changed. Something had alerted me, caused a slight tension in my fingers, squeezing a crystal glass filled with thick ruby wine, and I answered, without taking my eyes off his, "Right?" Almost like an echo, but without a shadow of a doubt, because even in this strange, overly verified moment, it seemed to me that I still had the situation under control. My husband, Vincenzo, the same man I had once fallen in love with in the scorching midday sun of Rome, now stood before me, looking both familiar and alien, and in his eyes danced the shadow of something long in the making. As it turned out later, he had been persuading his parents to slip me a contract, a dry, legally sound document, framed in a gilded folder, in which the demand was clearly and categorically set out, to give up all my property, every square meter of real estate, every investment, every percentage of income, everything that I had created with my own hands, mind and labor over many years. I smiled calmly, not out of weakness, not out of submission, but because at such moments calmness becomes the only weapon that does not betray, and, feeling the tension growing, how Alessia and Giuseppe's glances burned my skin through their smiles, I allowed myself a cold, ironic softness in my voice. "Then you won't care what I prepared," I said, as if we were talking about a dessert that was supposed to appear after the main course, and not about a carefully calibrated legal counterattack. At that moment my lawyer appeared, precise as a Swiss watch mechanism, impeccably dressed, with a stiff folder under his arm and a piercing gaze ready to tear apart any loopholes in the contract. No matter how refined the language was, his appearance was planned in advance, and although neither Giuseppe nor Alessia expected it, I knew that their surprise would be silent, dense, like a woolen blanket in the summer heat. And before we continue, write in the comments from which city you are watching this video. Enjoy watching. I met Vincenzo 6 years ago in Rome, at a time when my life resembled a marble staircase, strict, impeccable, and built upward by an effort of will, because then I was about 30 years old, and I was completely focused on my career, on deals, negotiations, calculations, and analyses, on those little things that add up to financial well-being, and I worked tirelessly to achieve what I achieved: stability, independence, inner peace, which are never given for free and do not come by chance. My specialty was real estate. I didn't just sell houses, I turned them into assets, flipped them, made smart investments, built complex deal structures, and built myself a comfortable life where there was nothing fancy, but everything was solid and reliable, like the concrete walls of the buildings I helped erect in the new neighborhoods of the city. Vincenzo, on the other hand, gave the impression of a man from a rich family, and at least then I thought so, because he had the composure, the self-confidence, the refined taste and manners of someone who grew up among marble, silk, and strict rules of dinner parties. He never talked much about money, but he always wore the best suits, bragged about the latest gadgets, pampered himself with everything expensive, and did it as if it was natural, as if there was no other way of being. His parents, Giuseppe and Alessia, were cut from the same cloth, reserved, confident, enveloping with a politeness that, on closer inspection, turned out to be cold as the smooth surface of a statue, and they carried themselves with the same old money attitude, as if they were originally above everyone else, as if heaven itself had appointed them masters of destiny, and their house, huge, furnished with antique furniture, decorated with majestic portraits of ancestors in gilded frames, created at every step an impression of wealth, almost provocative, but carefully rehearsed. But I was no naive woman with a fixed gaze and blind faith. I had met rich people before and worked with them all the time. I knew their ways. I knew where the facade ended and the real thing began, and even in Vincenzo's family there was something strange, elusive, like a subtle smell of mold in a perfect interior, and Giuseppe and Alessia exchanged casual remarks like, "You are so lucky to join our family, and a woman like you must be delighted with the security we can offer," and I should have wondered then why they assumed I was in such desperate need of stability. Vincenzo himself would occasionally raise alarm bells. He would borrow money and then forget to pay it back, claiming that it was just forgetfulness, not irresponsibility. Once he offered to put my name on a property he wanted to buy, assuring me that it would be more profitable from a tax point of view, and I immediately turned it off, mentally putting a cross on such requests. But for some reason I ignored these warning signs, convincing myself that there was nothing special about it, that everything was within the norm. Until they made their move that night. Vincenzo and I had been married for 2 years when his parents invited us to dinner at their estate, and there was nothing unusual about it. because they enjoyed luxurious family gatherings with expensive wine and endless discussions of heritage and tradition. But that evening the atmosphere was different, as if the air had become thicker from the moment we sat down at the table. A tension hung in the air like an invisible net stretched between gazes. Vincenzo looked animated, his mother was glowing with anticipation, and on his father's usually impassive face there was an expression of satisfaction, as if a long-awaited operation, planned for years, was about to be completed, and halfway through the meal Giuseppe cleared his throat like a speaker before a speech and, without saying a word, waved a stack of papers, placing it in front of me like a valuable offering demanding recognition. "We were thinking about the future," Alessia said in a warm, maternal tone, with that special overtone with which women can soften even a sentence, "about what is best for our family." I glanced at Vincenzo, who was watching my reaction closely, and, as if confirming the unbearable predictability of what was happening, Giuseppe added, pushing a pen towards me, "We need to guarantee stability." And then I realized that this was the very moment for which they had started all this, the moment when, in their opinion, I had to sign with a trembling hand the renunciation of everything that belonged to me and join their single financial entity, working in harmony. I picked up the first page and scanned it with my eyes, slowly, thoughtfully, letting each line sink into my mind like a truth scratched into marble. They wanted me to transfer literally everything, my savings, investments, real estate assets, even my personal current accounts, to a family trust under their complete control. And as Giuseppe pushed the pen toward me with an expression on his face as if he were handing me the key to a golden cage, my insides twisted, not with pain, no, with indignation, cold and clear, like water in a mountain river, because I suddenly realized how carefully and predatorily they had built this trap. "It's just a formality, baby," Vincenzo said softly, his voice sounding like velvet wrapped in poison, like a lie wrapped in care, and he flashed a confident smile in which I suddenly saw not warmth, but a calculating mask. "You trust me, don't you?" Something inside me snapped, not outwardly, no. I was calm, even too calm, but somewhere inside, in those deep layers that hold intuition, in which betrayal ripens, I felt a crack, not a catastrophe, but the beginning of the end. I leaned back in my chair, took a long, measured breath, allowing myself to smile slowly. "Then you'll like what's in my safe," I said, putting into my voice all that calm superiority that so often drove crazy those who thought they could control me. There was a silence in the room, not just a pause, but the kind of silence that falls over people when things aren't going according to plan. Vincenzo's grin faltered, just barely, but enough for me to notice. Alessia's knuckles turned white around her wine glass, and I could almost hear Giuseppe's jaw clench as their collective arrogance, the shiny illusion of confidence, began to crumble, crumbling like burnt silk under their fingers. They had been counting on my confusion, on my submission. Perhaps even on flattery, but they had certainly not been expecting defiance, especially not one so prepared and so cool. "What's in the box?" Vincenzo asked, his voice tense, no longer light or playful. "Oh, just some papers," I answered casually, shrugging my shoulders, as if you were talking about old postcards or a recipe collection. "Some documents. Something I prepared before the wedding to protect," I added, emphasizing the last word, and at that moment the silence in the room became even denser, as if the air had lost its ability to move. And then, as if by a carefully calibrated script, with absolute synchronicity, the butler entered the room, stamping his feet on the marble floor, and stopped a few paces away, his head slightly bowed. "Ma'am," he said politely, but with a slight touch of solemnity, "your lawyer is here." I wish I could record their expressions, their faces transformed into living pictures of shock. Vincenzo turned pale, as if he suddenly realized he was standing not on a stage but in a courtroom. Alessia looked as if she had been forced to swallow a lemon, sour and offensive, and Giuseppe simply stared at me, clutching the contract like the last anchor of common sense in the raging sea of what had not gone according to plan. A moment later, Clara, my lawyer, entered, slender, predatory elegance, with precise movements and a sharp gaze that seemed to cut right through. "Good evening," she greeted everyone, placing her briefcase on the edge of the table with the confidence of a surgeon about to operate. "I was told that there is a contract that my client must sign." Her voice was even, without fuss, but with such unshakable confidence that even the walls seemed to be on guard. Alessia was the first to pull herself together. "This is a private family matter," she said, in a tone that made her attempt at control sound like a false note in a symphony. No need for lawyers. Clara ignored her entirely, like background noise, opening the contract and leafing through the pages with an expression on her face as if she already knew what she would find. Then she laughed softly, but her laugh was sharp, short. "Oh," she said, shaking her head. "This is blatant financial manipulation." Vincenzo shifted uncomfortably, as if he had forgotten that this was not a private scene but a real legal demonstration. "It's not," he began, but Clara cut him off sharply. "In fact, it is," she said firmly, turning to me. "If you signed this, they would have complete control over your assets. They could empty your bank accounts, sell your assets, and you would be powerless to stop it." Alessia's face flushed red, as if a brand had been branded on her, and she tried to regain control. "It's about trust," she said, her tone sugary, trying to wrap her words around me like a thread. "That's right," Clara said flatly, sharply, categorically. "That explains why the contract states that they have full rights to withdraw funds, the right to sell real estate and make all important financial decisions, while my client cannot access her money without their approval." She turned to me, her face softening, her eyes glittering. "Marilla, you're lucky you have a lawyer who reads the fine print," she added, almost in a whisper, but each word cut the air. Vincenzo stood up abruptly, his chair creaking. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, looking me in the eye, demandingly, with the expression a man has when he looks at a bone stuck in his throat. "Why am I doing this?" I repeated, and my voice was calm, but behind this calm surface there was distrust, like a blade under a glove. "You just tried to take everything from me." Alessia's voice was cloyingly soft again. "Darling, it's just a misunderstanding." "No," I answered coldly, rising from my seat, exhaling slowly, as if erasing the remnants of illusions. "It's not like that. I'm done." As I stood up to leave, Vincenzo grabbed my wrist, firmly, slightly painfully, as if trying to force reality into the framework of his illusions, and his smirk disappeared, giving way to an icy gaze. "Don't do this," he hissed under his breath, barely opening his mouth. "In this family, you really don't want to make enemies." "Enemies?" I repeated, pulling my hand away and looking into his eyes with that clarity that comes before a storm. "That's exactly what you did to me." Alessia changed her tack abruptly, like an actress who realized that the audience had not bought into the previous script, and, letting out a shaky, strained, confidential laugh, she pressed her hand to her chest with theatrical grace, as if she were acting out a scene of great remorse in a soap opera. "My dear, you exaggerate," she said in a voice that was meant to be sympathetic, but in which the tremor of disappointment and impending defeat was all too clearly evident. "It's all just a big mess," she added, and this time her intonations were pleadingly soft, as if words could wipe away the damage that had already been done by the deed. I remained silent, letting her words hang in the air, growing like a stain on silk. She persisted, her eyes filling with the anxious glint of a trained manipulator. "We just wanted to keep you safe. This world can be so treacherous. Money slips through your fingers in an instant, and we wanted to protect you. Protect us all." "Safe?" I asked with a slight grin. "From what exactly?" "From yourself?" Clara, standing next to me with her shoulders slumped and a folder clutched to her chest, folded her arms and raised an eyebrow, not waiting for my approval. "If that were true," she said calmly but forcefully, "why did you structure the trust in such a way that my client had no control over her own money?" Giuseppe, who had been silent until then, sighed loudly, like a man tired of a pointless farce, and fixed a steely gaze first on his wife, then on his son, and said in a low voice, in which there was a hint of suppressed rage, "This has become unnecessary. Let's act like adults." I almost laughed, but instead I cocked my head to the side and repeated calmly, almost curiously, "Like adults? You mean the adults who try to deceive their own family?" His expression darkened, like a cloud blocking the sun on a clear day, but I did not retreat, did not lower my voice, did not give in to either the threat or the guilt, because now their desperation was so obvious that it was almost pathetic. They were counting on me being too excited, too emotional, to think logically, but they had seriously underestimated me. It was at this moment, when the delicate balance was almost breathing despair, that Alessia made her next sensational statement, playing the last card on which she had placed her greatest hopes. I suppose she began with an exasperated sigh, as if tired of childish stupidity. That means, she said slowly, looking at me with a forced smile, that you have no interest in the inheritance either. I turned my head in her direction, and the movement was almost mechanical, calm, precise, like the movement of a huntress's head when she notices movement in the grass. The inheritance. As soon as the word was spoken, Vincenzo cast a warning glance at his mother, like an actor who realizes that his partner has forgotten a line and broken the plot. But she continued. Oh, she said with feigned ease, did Vincenzo forget to mention his grandfather's estate in Rhode Island? A real family fortune. I felt Clara glance at me, and we both knew at the same time, this wasn't just about my finances. It was bigger. Deeper. More dangerous. The property is in probate, Alessia continued, lowering her voice slightly, as if revealing an intimate secret. And it will soon be under the complete control of the family. But if you're going to be so difficult, she trailed off, letting the words hang in the air like bait, tempting and sticky. She was toying with me, holding out the carrot, expecting me to seize on the promise of future wealth, that the fear of losing the opportunity to be part of the present would make me forget the betrayal. But all I saw was a disturbing picture, a family that knew how to take what was never theirs, with sophistication and shamelessness, and Vincenzo, who knew all about it but said nothing to me. I turned to him and looked him straight in the eye. Were you ever going to say anything? He ran his hand through his hair, as if trying to remove not just the strand but the question. I was waiting for the right moment, he managed with an uncertain half-smile. Okay, I said, and the word held the silence before the storm. When will things be better? Better for whom? He said nothing, because we both knew the truth. He would never have said anything if it hadn't come out. If it hadn't been for the safe. If it hadn't been for Clara. If I hadn't come to this dinner like a lamb they mistaken for a sacrifice. We left that night without saying goodbye, without looking back, without leaving any excuses or polite nods. In the car, Clara massaged her temples in silence, then sighed heavily and broke the silence. You know what's going on, don't you? Yes, I muttered, looking out the night window, where only my own thoughts were reflected. They're not just after my money. Exactly, she said, tapping her fingers on the side of her briefcase. If the Rhode Island estate is as big as they claim, they'll do anything to maintain control. And Vincenzo, believe me, is not a pawn in this game. He's an accomplice. I stared into the darkness beyond the glass, but the wheels were already turning inside me, connecting the disparate parts into a whole, and, almost inaudibly, I asked, what do you think the chances are that Vincenzo is in debt? Clara turned to me, narrowing her eyes. You think he's hiding something? I'm sure he is, I said calmly. In retrospect, it all made sense. His lavish lifestyle, his designer clothes, his way of showing off his money but almost never paying his bills. If he's drowning in debt, the trust was more than just a way to control me. This was his Virgin Mary. His last hope. The next morning, I did what I should have done long ago, back when the first shadows of innuendo began to flicker in his behavior, when his every gesture began to resemble a rehearsed movement, and his words a carefully selected script. I hired a private detective, not because I doubted, but because I needed facts, irrefutable, merciless, forged from numbers and records, capable of tearing the last veils from the lies that shrouded our lives. I demanded everything, credit histories, debts, transactions, everything that concerned Vincenzo, his every step, every document, every shady maneuver. And what I got was even worse than I imagined in my darkest guesses. Vincenzo was in debt, not just a debt hole, but a bottomless pit, credit cards maxed out, personal loans maxed out, business loans taken out in secret, and worst of all, one of them was registered in my name, with a forged signature he must have rehearsed long ago. I could feel the rage boiling inside me, slowly spreading through my veins, taking over my entire body until it was the only thing that allowed me to breathe. That evening, I returned home to where he was unknowingly sipping wine in the living room, and then I came face to face with him, icy calm, as if there was no hurricane raging inside me. How long have you been stealing from me? I asked, my voice low, but every word sharp as a blade. He blinked, as if he had just emerged from a dream in which he was still the hero. What are you talking about? I threw the papers the detective had printed at him. You took out a loan using my name. You wallowed in debt, lied to me, hid behind a smile, and at the same time hoped that I would sign everything so that you could solve your problems at my expense. This time he didn't even try to deny it. Instead, he did something worse. He laughed. A bitter, empty, joyless laugh. You were always so cautious, he chuckled, looking at me not with the eyes of a husband, but with the eyes of a gambler whose game was going wrong. I thought that eventually you would understand the big picture, that we needed to be practical about the future, but you just don't understand that, do you? My heart began to pound dully, as if warning me of the final step towards the abyss. So you planned all this? I whispered, looking at him, trying to discern even a shadow of remorse. He met my gaze, and his face wasn't stone, wasn't angry, it was empty, and that was the scariest thing. You have no idea what you started, he said, and I took a step back, feeling the adrenaline explode in my veins. Are you threatening me? He didn't answer. He just glanced at me, cold and distant, grabbed his coat, and slammed the door without turning around. I stood there, clenching my fists, not out of fear, but out of rage. If he thought it was all over, he couldn't have been further from the truth. I barely slept that night. The puzzle was coming together. Every strange action, every shadow, every conspiracy with his parents, everything was taking shape as a carefully thought-out, twisted scheme, built not only on greed but also on a deep contempt for those who believe. In the morning, my phone rang, and I immediately picked it up, hearing Clara's voice on the other end, tense, businesslike. You need to come to my office immediately. I didn't ask any questions. Half an hour later, I was at her place, and she was already waiting, with a folder on her desk, thick, heavy, as if it contained not just information, a sentence. You're not going to like this, she said quietly, pushing her toward me. I opened the folder, and my stomach twisted. There were photos. Women. Not just one. Two. Simone and Julia. He lied about more than just the money, Clara said, her voice coolly soft, like a doctor delivering a diagnosis. Simone was with him 2 years ago. He promised her an engagement, took out a loan in her name, emptied her savings, and then disappeared. I felt sick. And Julia? Clara shook her head, her gaze growing heavier. Julia, last year's target. Same thing. Only this time, he didn't follow through properly. He's still involved with her. He's engaged. Really? It took me a few seconds to process her words. Engaged? I asked, and even to myself I felt distant, as if I were speaking from another body. Clara nodded. He proposed. They were getting married in 6 weeks. My mouth went dry. It all came together in one horrible picture. He was my husband, but he was also the fiancé of another. And all this time he had been deceiving us both, separating us with miles and lies. And then it hit me. The inheritance in Rhode Island. The estate his parents had been so fussing over. Vincenzo needed to get married to unlock it. It explained the desperation with which he had held on to our marriage, and at the same time, why he was looking for a replacement. This was not about love. Not about partnership. This was part of a big, nasty scam. I knew I had to talk to Julia. Clara had arranged a secret meeting in a modest cafe in the city center the following afternoon, choosing a place that was deliberately faceless and inconspicuous, so that the meeting would take place without witnesses and unnecessary attention. And the moment I saw Julia enter through the glass door, I felt not triumph, not anger, not cold confidence, but an unexpectedly painful pang of sympathy, because her face, illuminated by the soft light, radiated genuine joy, that very naive, almost girlish joy that is born in anticipation of a wedding, a new life, a fairy tale that she, as I understood instantly, had managed to truly believe in. She was happy, excited, her whole figure, her gait, her gestures, the expression in her eyes, breathed a dream, and the thought that now I would destroy her illusions, forever connect her name with deception, caused me almost physical pain. I introduced myself, and as soon as I said the name Vincenzo, her face changed, her eyes flashed with suspicion, her lips trembled, and her voice became cautiously tired. How do you know him? Because, I answered, lowering my hand with the wedding ring on the table, he is my husband. Julia's reaction was instantaneous, almost instinctive. Her eyes widened, her face turned pale, her lips barely moved as she whispered, "It's impossible," and I immediately saw how despair and an attempt to maintain composure were struggling in her mind. "I'm afraid that's not true," I said quietly. Her trembling fingers darted into her purse, from where she took out her ring and placed it next to mine. Two identical rings, two symbols of the same lie, now lying side by side like a silent accusation. Then she began to cry, silently, tears rolling down her cheeks, and, gathering her courage, she began to tell her story, abruptly, haltingly, as if all that had happened were still somewhere in a dream. Vincenzo had told her about the coming inheritance, that he needed to be married to be entitled to it, had promised her a move to Europe, a new life, bright, glamorous, dazzling. And he had already convinced her to give him her savings. My hands clenched into fists. "Are you still in touch with him?" I asked, gently wiping the tears from her face. She nodded, as if ashamed. "Yes. He said he was taking me to meet his parents this weekend." I exhaled. "Perfect," I said, my voice like an order. "Let's ruin this little meeting." Julia nodded silently. She agreed to play along, and from that moment on she began writing to Vincenzo as if nothing had happened, maintaining the same tone, gentle, enthusiastic, full of expectation. Meanwhile, I dug deeper, clutching every scrap of information like a weapon. One of the forensic accountants I'd contacted through Clara had discovered an offshore account linked to Vincenzo, a secret, carefully disguised account used to funnel funds that were now clear to me to be illicitly obtained. The debt I knew about was just the tip of the iceberg. But I didn't stop there. I did a separate investigation into his parents, Giuseppe and Alessia, and found out that the so-called family estate in Rhode Island, around which their entire family drama had revolved, was not yet legally theirs. The inheritance process was drawn out, burdened with tax and legal complications, and to gain full control they needed an heir, married, with a solid legal basis. Vincenzo was their pawn. Their tool. And now I had all the ammunition to destroy their neat, polished scam. The evening of the big family dinner arrived. Everything was arranged, and Vincenzo was fully confident that he was about to introduce his dear, unsuspecting bride to his dear parents, expecting another theater of lies, in which he would be the conductor. Instead, something else awaited him. Shock. The naked truth. Julia and I walked in together. I took the first step into the hall, luxurious as always, and saw Giuseppe and Alessia already seated at a long table with a snow-white tablecloth, sipping wine as if they were presiding not at a dinner, but at a royal banquet. And as soon as my eyes met Alessia's face, I saw her mask crack. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, standing up, her voice breaking into a demand. I smiled serenely. "Do you really think I'd miss such a family celebration?" Right on cue, Vincenzo stepped into the hall, holding Julia's hand. He froze halfway, as if he'd crashed into an invisible wall, when he recognized me. And then Julia, standing next to me. Panic flashed in his eyes, and he didn't have time to hide it. "Baby," he muttered, turning to Julia, trying to maintain some control. Why is she here?" Julia crossed her arms, her gaze hard. "Tell me." There was a heavy pause, the air thick as before a thunderstorm. Alessia stood up abruptly, her voice rising to a scream. "This is absurd. I will not tolerate this farce at my dinner table." I grinned. "Oh, I think you should pay close attention." I looked at Clara, who stood by the door, like the final witness to the truth. "Would you like to begin?" I asked. Clara stepped forward, pulled out a folder, and laid the documents on the table in front of Giuseppe. "We'll start with the fraud," she said, her voice final, crystal clear. "And then we'll move on to the bigamy issue." The room exploded, as if the glass walls of all decorum, restraint, and false smiles had burst at once. Alessia let out a terrible, forced sigh, As if something had snapped inside her, broken under the weight of the revelation, Giuseppe slammed his glass down on the tabletop with such force that the thick red wine flew in all directions, leaving stains on the white tablecloth, like symbols of lost dignity. Julia, trembling with rage, took the wedding ring off her finger and with a force unexpected for her fragile figure threw it towards Vincenzo, and he himself, without moving, stood, clutching the edge of the table as if it were his last support, and looked at me with a look in which defeat, anger, shame and boundless, poisonous hatred were mixed. He understood everything. The facade had collapsed, the performance was over, the scam was exposed, the masks were torn off. But at the same time there was a silence, even heavier than the anger and the screams, a silence filled with tension, as if not the air but taut strings were humming between us, foreshadowing the catastrophe that had already begun its inevitable march. Alessia's face was distorted, her lips moved convulsively, as if she wanted to scream but could not find the words. Giuseppe, usually cool and taciturn, stared into the void, as if trying to imagine how tomorrow would turn out for him, now that everything they had invested effort and lies in had crumbled to dust. "Where did you find these absurd accusations?" Alessia finally hissed, finding her voice again, but there was no strength in it anymore, only wounded pride. Clara, without saying a word, placed a thick folder on the table, neatly, like a prosecutor at a hearing. "All the evidence is here," she said, calmly and clearly, turning the pages. "Bank statements, credit forms, forged signatures, as well as documents confirming that Vincenzo received a business loan using his wife's name without her knowledge or consent. This, let me remind you, is a criminal offense." Vincenzo flinched as if struck, but Alessia slammed her palm down on the table with fury. "This is a personal family matter." "No," I said firmly, looking up, "this stopped being a family matter the moment you tried to rob me. Now it's a legal matter." Julia, her voice shaking with rage, interjected, "What about bigamy, Vincenzo?" "Because last time I checked, I was engaged to a single man, not a married, lying con man." He stood up slowly, his chair creaking like the echoes of a chopping block, and began in a hushed tone, "Julia, I can explain." "Please tell me," she smiled bitterly, crossing her arms, her voice cold as ice. He swallowed, looked around as if searching for a way out, and, finding none, admitted, "Yes, I dated you when I was technically married. But it was not like you think. My marriage to her, it happened a long time ago." He waved in my direction, not even deigning to look at me. "We were just dragging our feet on the details." I snorted in disdain. "Drawing out the details? You were so annoying that you tried to make me sign documents that would strip me of my entire fortune. I think that's pretty active work on the details." Julia looked at him, her eyes shining with tears, but her voice was firm. "Everything you said, was it a lie? Plans? Dreams? A wedding?" He froze, and something flashed in his eyes, maybe regret, maybe fear. I meant it," he forced out. "I wanted this future with you, Julia." "When you were still married," she retorted, her voice dripping with contempt. Alessia, seething with anger, threw me a withering look. "You arranged all this. You arranged all this to ruin us." I laughed loudly, letting the sarcasm spill out. "Destroy you?" I repeated. "You did this to yourself." "I was just collecting evidence." Vincenzo was silent for too long, his shoulders shaking, and then suddenly he exploded. "You think you've won?" His voice cut through the room like a blade, quiet, menacing. Everyone froze, turning to look at him. His gaze was fixed on me. "You always acted like you were a saint, like you had the right to judge. But you're no better. You always liked having power. You held the purse in your hands, made me beg like a beggar. You enjoyed it." I raised my eyebrows slowly. "That's a funny way to describe how I protected my finances from a chronic liar." His face twisted. "You never trusted me. You never gave me a reason to," I countered calmly. He slammed his fist down on the table so hard that the dishes rattled, the cutlery shook, and the wine splashed into the glasses. "I was your husband," Vincenzo barked, his voice shaking, but not from pain, but from the rage that comes from a wounded ego. You should have supported me, not betrayed me like this, making me look like some kind of criminal. Julia instinctively took a step back, her eyes wide with shock, while Alessia looked genuinely stunned, like someone who had refused to believe in a storm until her house was washed away. For the first time in that long, painfully truthful evening, Giuseppe spoke up, his words quiet but weighty, like a final sentence: "Sit down." Vincenzo inhaled, sharply, noisily, flaring his nostrils, as if arguing, about to throw down a challenge, but under the weight of his father's gaze and all the truth that had fallen upon him, he slowly sank back into his chair, gripping the armrest so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Clara, without changing her tone or expression, cleared her throat, calmly took out the necessary papers, and, methodically looking through them, said, "Since passions are running high here, I suggest we get to the point." She picked up the first page, holding it lightly as a blade. "Julia has already filed a complaint for fraud," she said, "for the money you swindled from her under false pretenses. That's the first criminal charge." Vincenzo clenched his fists, as if hoping to squeeze reality. "The second," Clara continued, "is forging a signature on a loan agreement made out in your wife's name, without her knowledge or consent. All relevant signature samples have already been handed over to the investigation. Another criminal charge." Alessia, turning pale, opened her mouth, and her words came out in a broken whisper. Did you involve the police?" I nodded, looking straight into Vincenzo's face, not looking away. "Did you really think I'd let you get away with it? That you'd leave me with nothing, and I'd just give up?" He looked down. His hands were shaking. But Clara didn't let him drown in self-pity. "And finally, the question for which all this was started," she said. "The inheritance. The estate in Rhode Island. Those millions you counted on as your last life preserver. The probate court has long been aware of the true state of your family finances, and believe me, it knows more than you think." Giuseppe's sharp turn of head was almost reflexive. "What debt?" Clara, without changing her intonation, allowed herself a mysterious half-smile. "You didn't know? Your assets are frozen. Everything." The silence that reigned at the table was the kind that comes after an explosion, after the walls have collapsed. Alessia's cheeks turned completely pale. She grabbed the edge of the table as if it were a railing at an abyss. No, that can't be." "I'm afraid it can," Clara confirmed dryly, clicking her pen as if to put a period. "The real purpose of this whole scam was to combine my client's assets with yours to pay off your family's debts and preserve the inheritance. This is not love, this is business, and you lost." Alessia jumped to her feet, exhaling, "It's a lie." But her voice was shaking, and everyone understood. She knew. She had known for a long time. She just hoped that she would get out of it. Giuseppe was silent, his face darkened, his eyes staring into space. He knew too. And Vincenzo knew. Alessia, almost hysterical, turned to her son. "You're a fool. All you had to do was make an agreement. You should have seen it through." "Don't put all the blame on me," he said through his teeth. "It was your plan too. Your pressure. You pushed me." "I pushed you?" She spat. "And who screwed it up?" Giuseppe at this time closed his eyes and massaged his temples, like a man who had aged 10 years in an hour. He no longer tried to control anything. Julia, standing next to me, trembled, looking at Vincenzo with such contempt that not even a shadow of his former love remained in him. "I want him in handcuffs," she said in a breaking but determined voice. "Don't worry," I answered calmly, "it's already happening." Vincenzo turned his head to me, his gaze was almost pleading, almost hatred. "You couldn't do it," he whispered. "Look at me," I said, looking into his eyes. "I could." And then the sirens outside began to wail, short, clipped, relentless, like the truth itself. Vincenzo had been arrested that night, charged with fraud, identity theft, and bigamy, more than enough to keep him behind bars until his trial. His parents, whose pride had cost them everything, had lost their precious estate, their belongings seized and later confiscated. Even the family portraits were auctioned off. The next day, I met with Julia. We clinked glasses in silence, no toasts, just a heavy, cleansing relief. Some say that revenge doesn't solve anything, that it's pointless. But sometimes, when someone is trying to break you, the sweetest victory is not just surviving, but making their fall much, much more painful. Leave a comment on what you think of this story, and don't forget to subscribe and like it. See you soon.